Hi everyone, welcome to the New York Times in College webcast on crisis leadership. I'm Kathleen O'Connell, National Education Director at the New York Times. We'd love for you to join in the conversation, so please type your questions into the space provided, and I will relay those to our speaker. We're pleased to have with us today Laurie Goodstein. Laurie is our national religion correspondent. And so Laurie, the Pope recently said, "A leader who does not truly love all of his people cannot govern. At best, such a cold leader can discipline and achieve order, but not govern." How is he doing?
Well, I think it was no surprise when Time magazine made Pope Francis the Man of the Year. Of course, the runner-up was Edward Snowden, so when people ask me, what do you expect, it wasn't. Pope Francis seems to be attracting the attention not just of the Catholic Church, but really of the whole world. I mean, I hear from people of many different faiths who will say to me, "Oh, you're covering the Pope, isn't that exciting? I'm listening to him, I'm watching him." And I just have to tell you how extraordinary that is. Two previous popes, John Paul II, was also a magnetic world figure, so it's not as though this is unprecedented. But Pope Francis, I think, in who he is and some of the example he's setting, I think, is really a model for leadership, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about that. I know that I cover religion, and I know that it's a topic that engages lots of people. It's also a topic that alienates and is of no interest to many people, and that may be the case with some of you as well. But I want to tell you that in covering religion in the country and the world, and in covering trends the way I do, whether you are a person of faith yourself or not, it is the key missing ingredient to understand our world. And when also looking at, at leadership, there's lots of examples of leaders, good and bad, on the religious scene. I've met people in both those categories, and a lot of lessons to be learned from looking at religious leaders and how they employ their authority. So even for those of you who don't come to this with a particular interest in religion, I think that there's things that you'll find interesting. So I want to start with the day the world shifted, at least on my beat, which was February 11th, 2013. I was supposed to actually be coming out to Utah to talk to students like you at University of Utah and Utah Valley University as part of a New York Times program. And I actually I was supposed to give some lectures, and I actually don't love giving lectures. It's why, in part, I'm a journalist, is I like listening to people, not talking to people. And so I get very nervous. And so I was very prepared. I had a whole speech, had a couple of different speeches. I was kind of excited about the talk. I think that's one of the things that my training tells me is a lot of success in life, and certainly a lot of leadership is be prepared. Don't go into a meeting not knowing what it's about, or who you're going to be meeting with, or who you're going to be talking to, or what you want to get across. So I was totally prepared. I was not prepared, however, when I got this phone call that morning about 5:30 in the morning. I was supposed to get on a plane at about 8 in the morning, so I was getting ready to go to the airport, and the editor on the foreign desk said, "The Pope resigned." I said, "What do you mean the Pope resigned? Can he resign?" I didn't know. I never heard of such a thing. He said, "The Pope resigned and we need you in the office." So I had to completely retool what I was doing, all that preparation out the window, call the airline, call the people I was supposed to meet out in Utah, call the taxi company. And when I did, the taxi dispatcher said, "Why are you canceling? Is it because of the weather?" We were having a really bad snowstorm that day. And I said, "No, it's not because of the weather, it's because the Pope resigned." And he said, "What? The Pope resigned? Can he do that?" And so that's when I realized that that was kind of going to be a really big question that day. Can he do that? The Pope resigned. So I got into the office and was immediately asked, and it took me a while to get in because of this snowstorm. just felt completely unprepared for this. And editor comes over and says, we'd like you, your role is going to be to write an assessment of Pope Benedict, who just resigned. In other words, tell us what we should make of his 8 years in office, and before that, his decades of service to the church. Assess him. And let me tell you, no matter where you've gotten in life, and how much preparation and study you've done, there are moments, and that was one of them for me, that you just feel like, I can't do it. That's too big. It's too fast. You're asking me for something I'm not capable of. You have moments of crisis. I know you're looking at crisis leadership. And I want to admit that for me was really one of the most scary moments of my entire professional life, because I just felt like, I felt panicked that I can't do that. And so what I had to do was kind of draw on that well of, that well of knowledge and thought and depth that I did have and experience. And so if you ever find yourself in a situation like that, and you probably will, you probably can do it. You probably come through if you can go to that well and dip into it. Dip into that well of experience. There's probably more there than you realize when you're first confronted with a request that you think you don't live up to. And we all have those moments, really scary moments of panic. So that was one for me. But what I said about Pope Benedict was a lot about leadership, I think, and I think it is relevant to what you're thinking about and studying today, was that he was a magnificent scholar and thinker and writer. He could write for a popular audience. He had a very clear message for the church. But what I wrote was that if written words alone could keep the church on course, Pope Benedict would likely be viewed as a solid success. But he careened from one crisis to the next. It seemed like he didn't really want the job of leading the church. I'm paraphrasing now. This is not what I wrote. And I interviewed a scholar. That's one of the other ways that I went to the well of experience. I have lists and lists of experts I can call in a situation like this when I want to know what to make of it. It's not that it should come from me. I should draw on other people's expertise. That's what journalists do. That's what readers want to hear from us. They don't want my opinion. They want the most informed people, and what do they have to say? And this expert said something I thought was really kind of wrapped it all up. He said that Pope Benedict was actually an introvert, and that Benedict's papacy had been small and introverted, that he was more of a scholar. He wanted the job of a scholar, but that he wasn't really comfortable on the world stage. So that's not to say that's the be-all and end-all of Pope Benedict's papacy. There's a lot to look at and study there. I'm giving you something very superficial, admittedly, and not so much wanting to make a judgment, but wanting to make a point about the kind of leader that Pope Benedict was. He was very intellectual, very heady, and very much a man of profound words. So now we have this transition. The Pope has resigned, hasn't happened in 600 years or so. What do we do? Usually when there's a transition, a Pope dies, and immediately all the cardinals, as quickly as they can, come to Rome for a big meeting where they're going to elect the next Pope, called a conclave. In this case, there was this lag of several weeks because there was time to plan. It's not that the seat of the Pope was vacant. There was a Pope still in office. So anyway, about 2 weeks later, I traveled to Rome for the conclave to cover the election of the new Pope, and understand that there's a whole team of us doing this. I'm not the only one. I cover religion in the United States. There's a bureau chief in Rome. There are people who have expertise covering Italy who went with us. And so there's a whole crew of colleagues. We're all contributing stories. We're trying our best to be prepared and to be informed and to do the best job and bring our readers as much information as we possibly can. So what do? We do what every journalist in Rome is doing at that stage. We generate a list of papabile, people who might be the next pope. The candidates who, from our reporting and from our research, we think are probably going to be most discussed inside that conclave. And so we write them on a whiteboard and we kind of divide up the list among ourselves, and we write kind of short profiles of each one so that when the new pope is named, there you go, we've got a profile we can put up on our website. Of course, we're going to add to it, but we're prepared, right? Well, then came the moment, the announcement from the balcony of St. Peter's. There's thousands of people in the square ready for the announcement, and the name of the new pope is pronounced Jorge Mario Bergoglio from Argentina, and he took the name Francis, which no pope had ever taken before. And once again, we are completely unprepared. And I want to say that it wasn't just the New York Times that was unprepared. I did a CNN television interview soon after, was in their studios in Rome. They too had their whiteboard. They had many more names on that whiteboard than we had on ours. Not a one of them was Bergoglio. Why were we so unprepared? This is maybe a little inside baseball, but you're probably going to wonder, why weren't we able to predict? He had been a runner-up in the last conclave, likely contender in the last conclave. Why not this time? It's his age. It didn't have anything to do with his profile or his worthiness. It was that he was elderly, 78, when he was elected. And everybody figured from listening to cardinals who were going to be electing the next pope that they wanted someone young and vigorous and didn't want another transition soon. And so because of that, many, many journalists, with a few exceptions, had ruled out the cardinal from Argentina as the next pope. So let's talk about what Pope Francis does in his very first moments as pope. He says three words that are so simple, but signal the kind of pope that he's going to be. He says to the crowd, he says, "Pray for me." Now, usually one of the reasons that everybody's gathered in St. Peter's Square is not just to hear and to be present at a moment of history as the new pope is named and to say, "I was there," but also to receive his blessing. To receive the blessing from the Pope. But the Pope says, no, you pray for me. And that touched a lot of people because it signaled his humility, his understanding that he needs everybody in the church to help him in his papacy. And I think, when the books are written about the leadership style of Pope Francis, or the books that are going to be seen in the business bookshelves someday, I think that's a moment that they should use as a starting point. And since then, Francis has really been winning people over, and not just with his words, but with his actions. On Holy Thursday, which is pretty soon after he was elected, popes traditionally wash the feet of 12 of their priests. It's a ceremonial action that we come to expect from popes. What did Pope Francis do? He didn't wash the feet of priests. He went to a juvenile detention facility in Rome, and he had asked to have gathered together some of those young kids in juvie, basically. And he washed their feet. But who were they? They weren't just young male Catholics. Women, Muslims. And he didn't just do what often is done in a foot washing, where you kind of dab their foot with a wet cloth that you've dipped in water, very ceremonial. No, he really wash these people's feet. I mean, scrub the feet and spend time on his knees in front of each one of them. Well, this was a controversial action because he touched the feet of women, Muslims, but believe me, that action spoke. It said something about a message that he's been giving about inclusiveness in the church, that the church is to be for everybody, and about mercy. If he just gave a speech or a homily or issued an encyclical, a long papal pronouncement about mercy, okay, some people would read it. But it was what he did. It was caught on camera. And in fact, a lot of people actually kind of don't remember this. This was early in his papacy before he became a media rock star. But very early on, those of us following him said, whoa, he's washing women's feet. He's washing the feet of Muslims. This is someone we're going to have to pay attention to. He's sending signals. So you've probably seen pictures of him embracing disfigured people on his, during his Wednesday audiences when people come to hear him speak. There's been a lot of pictures. I mean, on Twitter, I'm on Twitter and been seeing them on Twitter. I've been retweeting these. If any of you want to follow me, I'll give myself a little pitch because I don't have a lot of Twitter followers yet. I'm Laurie G, NYT. And I retweeted these amazing photos of him. And again, not just kind of embracing or doing the, you know, double cheek thing they do in Europe, but really hugging people who are grotesque. In one case, a man with a very rare skin disease, someone that you would just recoil from. But no, he's really hugging and kissing this person. And in that action, he's sending a message. I mean, this is leadership. He's also very aware he's using the international media that is now so trained on him. And in what I think may be one of his most significant moves, on his first official trip outside of Rome, he went to the island of Lampedusa in Italy, where migrants who cross from Africa in boats, that's where they land, if they make it. A lot of times, the boats have been, you've probably seen this in the news, that they've been capsizing. Hundreds of people have been dying, and it's not migrants who've been coming to Lampedusa, but bodies coming to Lampedusa. This is a crisis in Europe. And the Pope went to Lampedusa to celebrate a mass with migrants and, you know, gave a message about the importance of welcoming migrants, not turning them away, and that Europe has to do something about this. The whole world has to make this a priority. So he's had a lot to say, too. It's not just that he's leading by action. He is also giving interviews. He's written a long apostolic letter that is being picked over. Not everything he's said has been welcomed by every Catholic or every person in the world. Some of it has been controversial, but certainly by what he's been doing, he is trying to send signals about what he thinks are global priorities, and some of these are political priorities, you know, welcoming migrants, poverty, caring about people who are, you know, in the Church's terms, the least of these. But he's also not just sending a signal to political leaders, but also people every day. When you hear the Pope talk about caring for the poor or the homeless, I'm finding, even just in New York City, when I commute, you know, I go through subways, I walk on the streets, I pass homeless people all the time. It is much harder for me just to walk by those homeless people now and not think about them, not think about Pope Francis, and think about what he has to say about them, and think about, well, what should I do? You know, what's my responsibility here? And you know, I think the Pope is potentially having that impact worldwide. It's trickling down, and that it's going to be a very interesting papacy to watch. So whatever your priorities are, the things that you're interested in leadership, you know, what is it that you're interested in leading on? Think about action. You know, think about having your actions send a signal about what it is you want other people to do and say. No better way of leading than, you know, being the first or being someone who models what it is you believe to other people. So anyway, I don't mean to lecture, but as you can probably tell, I'm very excited about my job and this Pope and this unexpected moment, and just do my best to cover it and bring you guys stories that you want to read. So excited to hear from you. What do you want to know?
Thanks, Laurie.
Okay.
To get started, he's been called the Pope of the People, and I think you've illustrated that. When he washed and kissed the feet of the Muslim girls, he really showed a humility that you don't often see from leaders. And I think also when he embraced the severely disfigured man, there were a surprising number of tweets. Yeah. Not just from Catholics, but what I found so interesting is that even the atheists really love him. And there was one woman who said, I may be an atheist, but there's something about Pope Francis that makes me want to be Catholic. He's so inspiring. And another wrote, you guys know I'm about as atheist as they come, but man, this new Pope continues to inspire me. Have you seen other national religious leaders who have done what Pope Francis has been able to do in such a short time? And I think his words, who am I to judge? I mean, it's like kind of sparked a national, people are just really impressed with this guy. Are there others who?
Well, I think that says something about the nature of leadership, and in some ways religious leadership, is that it can transcend whatever the institutional religion or the faith group is that person leads. So obviously Pope Francis is aware that he's not just speaking to Catholics, he is speaking to the world, and he has the world's ear. The reason I think his papacy has been of such interest and inspiration to atheists and people of no faith is that he has from day one recognized that non-believers exist. They're worthy human beings, and they're part of who he wants to be in conversation with. One of the first things popes do after they're elected is they meet the global press. And it's a very formalized kind of meeting. It's more like an address in a big meeting hall near the Vatican, and there's hundreds of reporters there. When he greeted the reporters, Pope Francis, he made a point of saying, I'm greeting the Catholics in the audience, I'm greeting the Protestants, I'm greeting Jews, and I'm greeting you of no faith. And let me tell you, the reporters in that room people noted that. That was unusual for the Pope to acknowledge that, hey, there are lots of people who don't claim a faith. And that the Pope is aware that growing numbers of young people in Europe, in the United States, in his home country of Argentina, are seculars. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily committed atheists, but just that these are people who say, I'm not anything. He wants to also be a leader for those people too. And so he's been doing things like he did a long interview with a famous journalist in Italy who's an atheist and who's very out there about being not just a non-believer but an confirmed atheist. He's not afraid of these people. He's not put off by people who don't believe. He has more said, I want to be engaged with you. And so anyway, I think that will be another hallmark of this papacy, is that he's someone who recognized that the world is made up of believers and non-believers, and increasingly non-believers actually. Growing percentages of populations worldwide are non-believers. And so the way for a church leader even to deal with that is not to pretend they don't exist or to say these are bad people, but to say, let's talk. So I don't know if that answered you. There were a lot of questions in your question, but I think the Pope and atheists is a really interesting thing to look at.
We have a question from Sylvester. How do you prepare when you go back to your office with your notes about religious ideas?
Well, a lot of my story ideas come from kind of just hearing from people. That's the first thing, is that the ideas are not, say, handed to me by editors. Though the story I told you about what to do when Pope Benedict resigned, that was an editor's assignment. But most of the stories I do come from, following what's going on in the world of religion, hearing from regular sources, hearing by, from people out of the blue who get in touch with me and give me ideas. And so then what I do is I have this long list at any one time of way too many great stories. And I'm not the only one who covers religion at the New York Times. There's a colleague on the national desk, somebody on Metro, as I mentioned, people in Rome. We have bureaus around the country. Sometimes if I can't get to the really good stories, because I think there are way too many, I'll talk to my colleagues, say, in bureaus around the country and say, hey, there's something really great happening in your geographic territory. I could help you do it, or could introduce you to the right, to people to talk to about it. But the way I prepare is often I'll start by doing as much research as I can. Sometimes that's from reading, sometimes it's from interviewing scholars in a field, because I've been covering religion for a long time, but it's way too huge a subject for me to have expertise in everything I have to know. So what I do is go to the people who have really been spending a long time studying those things. I'll do long interviews with those folks, and then I'll interview the people who are kind of the players in a story. And sometimes I have the luxury of allowing, sometimes being able to spend days or a week on a story, which a lot of reporters don't have. That's one of the marvelous things about working at the New York Times, is we have sometimes a little more time to tell our stories. So anyway, that's a little bit of the process. There's more to say, but just tons and tons of research, face-to-face reporting. I'll often go to the place after I've done that kind of pre-research and interview lots of folks, and then come home with very full notebooks, of which I have some here, and try and make sense of it all.
Okay, as a journalist, how do you distinguish between what the Vatican or other religious groups preach as opposed to what is practiced? Is there a distinction?
Yes, and I actually think that's one of the important things that I have to do, is not just look at the scriptural sources or the written words, in the case of the Catholic Church, say the encyclicals or the homilies given by a bishop or given by a priest, but also look at how this plays out in the real world. And there is often a gap between what is being taught and what is being practiced, or what is even being believed by people. And that is often some of the most interesting, that kind of divide is often some of the most interesting stories. So I think that if you just were to look at, say, scripture or textual or theological bases for religion, you'd be missing much of the story, because the way religion is lived, I think, is a big part of covering the story of religion and people of faith.
Thanks, Laurie. We have time for one more question. Okay. To evaluate the Pope's leadership, do you think it's important that it be done in the proper context? It can't be done properly, interpreted through the same lens we use to evaluate an American president, for example, which is often done? Mm-hmm.
It's true. I think whoever's sent in this question kind of understands that sometimes we use political frames of reference to understand religious leaders or religious events. And I think that often that's a mistake. One of the common mistakes is kind of left-right. Oh, this religious leader is on the left. This one is on the right. And people often try to do that with popes and with the Catholic Church, which I think Catholic teaching transcends left and right and can't easily be characterized as, oh, this is liberal, this is conservative. So I think that's one of the pitfalls that, often when you'll see political reporters covering religious leaders or covering religious events, people fall into, traps like that. I think often that, part of what I try to help readers do is understand the different planes that religious leaders are often operating on. It's not so much that they're necessarily trying to win votes or trying to win precincts or playing to this particular constituency or not. It often has to do with belief and understanding of theology and understanding of scripture. Why would, say, this or that religious leader make this decision? Well, it often has to do with the source, the source that they're taking their belief or understanding from. So I know I'm talking more generally, but I think that religious leaders and religious events should be interpreted slightly, differently than we understand religious leaders, than we understand political leaders and political events.
Right.
I hope that helps.
Well, thank you so much, Laurie, for joining us, and thanks everyone else for listening.
Thanks for having me. It was fun, even though I can't see any of you.